He stood still, shoulders trembling, eyes wet with something far deeper than sorrow. King Charles in tears, crying face, and across from him, Prince Edward, silent, until now, because Edward has broken that silence with a truth so personal, so piercing. It brought the king to his knees. What did he see that shattered his composure? Why did he hold it inside for decades? And why now? For years, the world has watched the royal family with fascination. The power, the protocol, the polished perfection. But behind those palace walls, something fragile was breaking. And now, after decades in the shadows, Edward has spoken. His words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like thunder. The truth had been hidden in silence for years. The British royal family has always walked a delicate line, a tightrope between public adoration and private torment. On the balcony, they wave with grace. Behind closed doors, they wage silent wars. Every glance is curated, every word rehearsed. But even the most polished image can't conceal everything. Princess Diana knew that better than anyone. She was a fairy tale princess, beloved by millions, photographed by the world, adored by a public hungry for something real. But inside the palace walls, she was alone, watched, judged, often dismissed. She struggled, not just with royal protocol, but with isolation so deep it echoed. Many in the family kept their distance, maintaining a cold formality. But not everyone. There was one who saw more than he was meant to, one who watched, quietly, silently, as history unfolded behind gilded doors. Prince Edward, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's children, the one who rarely made headlines, the one people often forgot. While his brothers were thrust into scandal or ceremony, Edward remained in the background, the invisible prince. But invisibility has its advantages. He noticed things others didn't. He listened when others dismissed. And when Diana's light began to flicker in the shadows of the palace, it was Edward who saw the truth and never forgot it. This isn't just a story of grief or guilt. It's a story of quiet loyalty, buried truths, and a moment a silent witness could stay silent no longer. Underscore, because beneath the pageantry and protocol, something deeply human was unfolding, something no camera ever captured. And it's time we finally heard his side. In the early days, Diana sparkled, a fresh face, a hopeful heart, the embodiment of everything the monarchy wanted to appear. But behind the palace gates, that light began to dim. The fairy tale was never real. Charles, distracted and distant, never offered the warmth she craved. The institution, rigid and cold, offered even less. She was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. And that's when Prince Edward began to notice. He was barely in his 20s and younger, quieter, always on the sidelines. But unlike the rest, he didn't look past her. He saw her. In corridors between royal engagements, Edward would offer her a soft smile. At formal dinners, a whispered joke under his breath. Small things, gestures that seemed insignificant to others, but meant everything to her. There are rumors of letters Diana wrote in her most vulnerable moments, notes tucked away in journals or shared in secret, where she referenced Edward as her silent ally, someone who didn't pretend not to see, someone who made her feel, if only briefly, that she wasn't completely invisible. But not everyone welcomed their quiet bond. Charles noticed, and he didn't like it. There were whispers of a heated confrontation, one not recorded in official memoirs, but remembered by staff who caught fragments of it in echoing halls. Charles, reportedly furious, accused Edward of taking sides, of stepping out of line, of choosing her. Edward didn't argue. He didn't shout back. He just left the room. Because Edward's silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't obedience. It was something far more powerful, a quiet rebellion. In a family built on performance, he chose presence. In a palace full of power games, he offered compassion. And though he never publicly defended Diana, she knew, and he never forgot. The palace grew colder, and so did the world outside. Diana, once hailed as the people's princess, became tabloid prey, her every move twisted, her every flaw magnified. Her tears were headlines. Her paying entertainment. The royal family stood firm, detached, silent, regal, except Edward. He watched it all unfold. The smear campaigns, the televised torment, the press vultures circling. He saw Diana shrinking, unraveling, reaching out in ways only those truly paying attention could understand. Behind the stoic mask, Edward wrestled with something far more agonizing than silence. Loyalty or truth. He was a prince, bound by duty, taught from birth to protect the crown above all else. But he was also a man, a brother-in-law, a witness to suffering that others chose to ignore. In private, those closest to Edward noticed a change. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, not with apathy, but with weight. He stopped attending some public events. At others, he appeared stiff, his smile strained. There's a haunting moment, captured on camera, where Edward stands behind Diana during a formal event. She's waving, smiling at the crowd, as always. He's still, eyes locked on her, not with admiration, but concern, almost as if he knew. He wanted to speak. He wanted to scream. But he didn't, because to speak out meant betrayal, not just of family, but of everything he'd been raised to protect. And then it happened. August 31st, 1997. Paris. A tunnel. Silence. Diana was gone. And with her, any illusion that the system worked. Edward didn't make statements. He didn't weep for cameras. But those who saw him that week, truly saw him, described something different. A prince shattered not just by grief, but by guilt, because he had seen it coming. He had watched it all unfold, and done nothing. The disillusionment ran deep. From that point on, Edward's relationship with the firm shifted. He kept his head down, took on quieter royal duties, and avoided the spotlight as much as he could. He never publicly clashed with Charles, but the air between them was never quite the same. Behind the smiles were years of unspoken words, bottled tension, and a shared grief that was never shared out loud. Edward didn't disappear, but something inside him did, and the weight of that silence only grew heavy with time, not from a press conference, not from a scandalous tabloid leak, but in a quiet, reflective moment, buried deep in a documentary few expected to make headlines. Prince Edward was being interviewed about the legacy of the monarchy. Routine questions, standard answers, until they asked him about her, about Diana. For a second, he paused, eyes lowered, fingers briefly fidgeting in his lap. Then he spoke. His voice didn't shake, but it wasn't steady either. She was not perfect. None of us are. But she was human, and at times, the only one among us brave enough to be human. He didn't mention names. He didn't assign blame. But every word carried the weight of 2 decades of silence. I saw someone who was hurting, and I saw how we, all of us, ignore that pain. I stayed quiet. I thought I was protecting the family, but maybe I wasn't protecting the right person. The room was silent. The interviewer, stunned. Edward looked up, eyes tired, not from age, but from memory. I still think about her, what she endured, what she gave, and what she never got back. When those words aired, they didn't just ripple. They crashed through the carefully constructed image the royals had spent years maintaining. And somewhere behind palace walls, King Charles watched. No cameras caught his reaction. But according to sources close to him, aides, longtime friends, he was deeply moved. Shaken, even, one reported. He wasn't crying as a king, but as a man who had finally heard the truth he'd been trying to avoid. Edward's words weren't explosive. They weren't vengeful. They were gentle but unmistakable. A quiet reckoning. For decades, the family had held tight to tradition, to image, to duty. But in a few softly spoken sentences, Edward held up a mirror to it all. To the silences, the mistakes, the humanity lost in the name of monarchy. Some saw it as betrayal, others as healing. Because for the first time, someone inside the palace acknowledged what so many felt on the outside, that Diana wasn't just failed by the press or by fate, but by the very institution she married into, and that even within those stone walls, someone did see her, someone did care, even if they couldn't save her. It wasn't a royal scandal. It was something deeper, an emotional confession, a soft revolution. The invisible prince had finally spoken, and what he said echoed louder than any headline ever could. Understood? It wasn't just Diana who was finally seen. It was Edward, too. And in that moment, something shifted. The response was immediate and emotional. Across the UK, across the world, Edward's words landed like a whispered truth everyone had been waiting to hear. People didn't react with scandal. They reacted with sorrow and admiration. Because in a family known for stoicism and silence, here was a prince finally speaking from the heart, not in polished statements, but in raw human honesty. Social media lit up. Clips from the documentary were shared millions of times. Headlines called it a rare royal reckoning. Many who had once overlooked Edward began to see him differently, not as a forgotten prince, but as a quiet witness who carried more than anyone realized. One commentator wrote, "Perhaps it's the ones who say the least who understand the most." And what of the palace? Silence. No official statement. No public endorsement. Just a carefully placed photo of Charles attending an event. Smiling, waving, business as usual. But it didn't go unnoticed that in his next speech, Charles's voice faltered when mentioning those we've lost too soon. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Insiders say he was deeply affected, not just by what Edward said, but by the fact it was said at all. Because sometimes it's easier to defend silence than to face the truth buried beneath it. And for Charles, that truth was painful. He had lost her, not just in death, but in life. He had ignored the warnings. He had pushed away what he couldn't control. And now, the mirror had been held up. But perhaps the most profound shift was in how the world began to speak about Diana. She was no longer just a radiant icon, the glamorous mother, the tragic figure chased by paparazzi. She became something more real, a woman who was wounded, misunderstood, and finally, acknowledged by the very institution that failed her. Because Edward's words didn't rewrite history. They filled in its silence. They gave voice to the things we all suspected but had never heard confirmed. They transformed Diana's pain from distant memory into urgent truth. And in doing so, they forced a quiet reckoning with the question, has the royal family truly changed, or has it simply learned to hide better? That question still lingers. But one thing is certain, not all truths come with trumpets and breaking news. Some come softly, after years of silence, from those we least expect. Understood? And sometimes it's the quietest people who carry the loudest truths. So what would she say now? If Diana could hear Edward's words, soft, honest, unguarded, would she smile? Would she cry? Would she finally feel seen? We'll never know. But perhaps, somewhere beyond the cameras and the chaos, she already does. Edward didn't offer revelations meant to shake the monarchy. He didn't accuse or expose or betray. He simply told the truth, his truth, and in doing so, he gave Diana something she had been denied for far too long. Acknowledgement, not just of her pain, but of her humanity. This wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about facing it. And maybe, just maybe, it was a step, not for the institution, but for the individuals inside it, towards something softer, something better. Because healing doesn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a single moment of courage, a single choice to care. The monarchy continues, as it always has. Ceremonies unfold. Portraits are painted. Statements are scripted. But now, in the backdrop of that age-old machinery, Edward's voice lingers, quiet but unforgettable. And perhaps that's all he ever wanted. Not to take sides, not to play politics, but to remind the world and his own family that kindness is not weakness, that silence is not always strength, and that sometimes doing nothing can echo louder than speaking out. Understood? In the end, Edward didn't need to take a side. He simply chose to be kind. And for a woman who lived her final years aching to be understood, that kindness mattered more than anyone knew. The royal story goes on, complex, polished, guarded. But something is different now, because in a palace built on silence, a whisper of truth was finally heard.